The procession left Aldermere House at 9:30 on a Tuesday morning in October, and from the very beginning, something was wrong with it. Not the carriages. The three lacquered vehicles bore the Aldermere crest in gold and black, their wheels newly polished, their horses matched bays, chosen for exactly the sort of beauty that turned heads along the village roads of Dorset. The outriders sat straight. The coachmen wore their livery pressed and clean. Lady Aldermere herself occupied the first carriage with her two daughters, Philippa and Charlotte, each arranged against their cushions with the practiced elegance of women who had been trained since childhood to be observed. What was wrong was the figure walking behind the last carriage, not beside it, not within it. Behind it, at a distance of perhaps 8 feet, as if she had been tethered to the vehicle by an invisible chain and then forgotten about. She wore a traveling dress of dark brown wool, plain at the collar, without so much as a ribbon to break the severity. Her boots were sensible. Her hair was pinned beneath a bonnet that had seen better seasons. She carried a small bag in one hand and held her chin at an angle that suggested she was very deliberately not looking at the ground. Her name was Marin Ashby. She was 23 years old, the natural daughter of the late Earl of Aldermere by a woman Lady Aldermere had never acknowledged, and would not have in her house except for the fact that the late Earl's will had required it. The will had been very specific. Marin Ashby would be housed, fed, and transported wherever the family traveled for a period of 5 years following the Earl's death, after which a modest annuity would pass to her. The annuity was already calculated to be just barely enough to survive on, which Lady Aldermere had ensured when her own solicitor reviewed the original document and found the one clause that was negotiable. Transport. The will said transport. It said nothing about comfort, and so Marin walked. She had been walking behind carriages for 14 months now. Not always. Not on short trips within the county, but on journeys of any significance, on the occasions when Lady Aldermere wished to make a point visible to the roads they traveled. Marin walked. The servants whispered about it. The village people stared. Twice, strangers had approached the procession to ask whether the young woman required assistance, and twice the outrider had informed them, with finely calibrated indifference, that she was quite all right. Marin never spoke during these episodes. She had learned very early that speaking made things worse. Today's journey was 16 miles. They were going to Westhaven Park, the country seat of the Duke of Ravensmore, where Lady Aldermere had secured an invitation to a fortnight's house party. The invitation was a coup of considerable social engineering. The Duke of Ravensmore entertained rarely, received selectively, and was considered by everyone who had ever tried to study him, which was everyone in polite society, to be essentially impervious to ordinary social pressure. He had neither sought a wife in the 5 years since inheriting the title, nor shown the slightest interest in any of the eligible women his mother's friends persistently placed in his path. He was 34 years old. He was wealthy beyond ordinary comprehension. He was built like a man who had spent considerable time outdoors and not enough time in drawing rooms, with dark eyes that people found either compelling or deeply unsettling depending on the nature of their own conscience. His name was Julian Ashford, and every woman in 3 counties had at some point imagined marrying him. Lady Aldermere had brought Philippa and Charlotte because they were her best hope. She had brought Marin because the will required it. She had positioned Marin behind the carriage because it made the distinction between them absolutely clear to anyone they passed. Marin had counted the milestones since Aldermere House. They had passed 4. 12 remained. The road curved through woodland for a stretch, and the shadow of the trees fell cool across her face, which she welcomed. The October morning was mild enough, but walking generates heat, and she had not been offered water before they set out, and she would not ask. She had long since stopped asking for things that were within Lady Aldermere's power to withhold, and that therefore would be withheld simply to demonstrate the power. She thought instead about the annuity. 3 years and 8 months from now. She had worked out, using the late Earl's library and her own careful accounting, that if she lived extremely simply, The annuity would sustain her in a small cottage in a county where no one knew her name. She could take in sewing. She could teach children their letters. She had considered, in her more optimistic moments, that she might eventually save enough to buy a small press and produce the kind of practical guides for rural households that nobody published because nobody thought the market worth serving. She had thought about this a great deal. It kept the miles from stretching too long. The fifth milestone passed beneath her boots. Ahead, the carriage slowed slightly as the road narrowed through a village. She could hear the horses' changed rhythm. She could hear, faintly, Charlotte's laugh from inside the first carriage, bright and careless and utterly unself-conscious. Charlotte was 19, and had never once considered what it might mean to be in Moran's position. Not because she was cruel, but because she genuinely lacked the imagination for it. Philippa was 22 and possessed imagination in abundance, which she directed entirely toward herself. Moran walked through the village. People paused to watch. A woman outside a milliner's shop held her daughter's hand and watched Marin pass, and then watched the carriages pull ahead, and the expression on the woman's face was one Marin recognized. Not pity exactly, something sharper. The particular discomfort of witnessing something that is wrong in a way you cannot easily name. Marin did not look at her. She looked at the road and she kept walking. The sixth milestone. 10 to go. They arrived at the gates of West Haven Park at 12:15, which meant Marin had been walking for nearly 3 hours. Her feet were sensible rather than painful. She had learned to pace herself. She was thirsty and she would have welcomed a seat, but she held her bag at her side and her chin at its angle, and she walked through the great iron gates behind the third carriage, exactly as she had walked through every other gate on this journey. What she had not anticipated was the crowd. West Haven Park's drive was lined with visitors. Not merely the receiving household, the standard procession of servants arranged in formal welcome. There were other guests arriving simultaneously from multiple directions, carriages and horses and outriders converging on the great house at what appeared to be a precisely coordinated hour. The drive was perhaps a quarter-mile long, and it was currently occupied by no fewer than 6 separate parties, all moving toward the house at once, their servants and luggage creating a slow and ceremonious river of arrival. And at the head of this entire procession, mounted on a gray horse that managed to look both powerful and impossibly calm, was the Duke of Ravensmore himself. She did not know him on sight. She had never met him. But there was something about the way the converging groups oriented toward this particular man, the way even other carriages adjusted their pace in unconscious deference to his position, that made his identity apparent. He was not performing authority. He simply possessed it, the way certain objects possess their own specific gravity. He was speaking to a gentleman on his right. His horse moved with slow, unhurried steps. He was not looking at the carriages. He was not looking at anything in particular. His attention had the quality of a wide lens, taking in the whole rather than any single part of it. Then something made him look. Later, Marin would try to identify what it was. Not a sound, not a gesture on her part, perhaps simply the wrongness of it, the visual incongruity of a single figure on foot behind a carriage that had otherwise arrived in perfect aristocratic order. Whatever the cause, the Duke's gaze moved from the general sweep of the drive to the Aldermere procession specifically. And then, without any drama whatsoever, without any change of expression that she could detect from her distance, it moved to her. She became aware of being watched the way you become aware of a change in temperature. She did not look up immediately. She kept walking. She was perhaps 50 yards behind the third Aldermere carriage now, and the drive was smooth, and she had no reason to alter her course, or her pace, but the watching continued. And then something happened that would be described in different ways by the various witnesses who later tried to account for it. The Duke's horse stopped, not stumbled, not shied, simply stopped, as cleanly and decisively as if the command had been given and immediately obeyed. The Duke held one hand up in a gesture that was not dramatic, but was somehow completely visible across the crowded drive, and the procession around him slowed, and then stilled, and then stopped altogether. 16 horses, 6 carriages, perhaps 40 people on foot. All of them stopped. And in the peculiar silence that followed, the Duke of Ravensmore dismounted his grey horse, handed his reins to the nearest groom without looking at him, and walked back along the drive toward Marin Ashby. She stopped walking when it became clear that he was walking toward her, and not past her. The distance between them closed. She was aware of the stopped procession to her left, of the particular stillness that a crowd achieves when it is watching something it does not yet understand. She was aware of the Aldermere carriage, directly ahead, and of the window, which was now open, and of Lady Aldermere's face in that window, which was the color of uncooked pastry. The Duke stopped before her. Not at a social distance. Close. The kind of close that requires acknowledgement. She had been right about his eyes. Dark and direct and carrying no particular warmth or coldness, only a quality of attention so complete it was almost uncomfortable. He was taller than she had estimated from a distance. He was looking at her with exactly the same focus he had directed at the drive, the wide lens quality now narrowed entirely onto her face. He removed his riding glove from his right hand with 2 neat movements. He extended that hand to her, palm up. An unmistakable gesture, an offered hand. The kind offered to a woman you intend to assist into a carriage. Marin looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She looked at the stopped procession, at the 40-odd people who were watching this with varying degrees of astonishment, at the Aldermere carriage window, where Lady Aldermere's face had passed from white to a color approximating plum. She said quietly, because she had learned the value of quiet, "Your Grace, I am afraid there has been a misunderstanding. I am not a guest." "You are walking behind the Aldermere carriages," he said. His voice was lower than she expected and carried in the strange hush of the halted procession. "Yes. Why?" It was such a simple question that she almost answered it with the simple truth. "Because I am required to walk rather than ride. Because Lady Aldermere finds it useful. Because no one has stopped her." Instead, she said, "The arrangement was made by my stepmother." "Your stepmother?" He repeated it without inflection. "Lady Aldermere." Something crossed his face, not surprise. Something more contained than surprise, but in the same family. He said, "You are the late Earl's daughter." "His natural daughter, yes." A pause. Not a long one. "I see." He did not lower his hand. "Will you take it?" She looked at the hand again. She thought about what would happen if she took it. She thought about 3 years and 8 months and the cottage and the small press and the careful future she had been building in her imagination mile by mile. She thought about what Lady Aldermere's face would look like if she climbed into a carriage in front of 40 witnesses, including the Duke of Ravensmore himself. She thought, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that there was a moment happening right now that would not happen again. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, firm and certain and warm through the absence of his glove. He turned and walked her, with complete unhurried composure, toward the nearest carriage, which happened to be the one directly ahead, and which happened to belong to Aldermere House. He opened the door himself. He offered his hand again to help her step up. She climbed in. She sat on the seat across from Charlotte, who was staring at her with her mouth open. Philippa, beside Charlotte, had gone very still. Lady Aldermere sat in the far corner and said nothing, because for the first time in 14 months, she had absolutely nothing to say. The Duke closed the carriage door. Through the window, Marin watched him walk, back to his horse, mount, with the same economy of movement with which he had dismounted, and gesture once. The procession resumed. No one spoke in the Aldermere carriage for the entire remaining quarter-mile to the house. The house party at Westhaven Park had been arranged by the Duke's mother, Lady Marguerite Ashford, with the precision and barely concealed ambition of a woman who had been patient for long enough and was now exercising that patience's absolute final reserves. She had invited 12 families. She had selected the guest list with the care of a botanist selecting specimens, and she had managed, through considerable correspondence and 3 separate visits to London, to ensure that every eligible young woman present was exactly the sort of young woman a sensible duke ought to consider. Well-born, well-mannered, financially solid, attractive without being the kind of attractive that suggested unreliability. She had not anticipated the scene on the drive. She heard about it before the last carriage had reached the house, because her housekeeper's cousin was an undergroom who had witnessed every detail and passed it to the housekeeper within 7 minutes of the Duke dismounting. By the time Lady Marguerite descended the front steps to greet her arriving guests, she had heard 3 different accounts with a total of 4 contradictory details, and the only point on which they unanimously agreed was that her son had halted the entire procession to walk back and offer his hand to a young woman, walking alone behind the Aldermere carriages. She was therefore watching very carefully when Lady Aldermere descended from her carriage, followed by Philippa and Charlotte, followed last by a young woman in the dark brown wool, who moved with a particular quality of stillness that Lady Marguerite recognized because she had possessed it herself at 23, the stillness of someone who has learned to make very little noise. Lady Aldermere performed her greeting with the skill of a woman who has spent 30 years converting embarrassment into dignity. She smiled. She complimented Westhaven Park's facade, which she had never seen before but described as if it were an old acquaintance. She introduced Philippa and Charlotte with a practiced warmth that had cost her nothing except the effort of maintenance, and she did not introduce Marin. Marin stood 2 steps behind the Aldermere daughters. She did not attempt to introduce herself. She waited. Lady Marguerite looked at her directly and said, "And this is?" The pause before Lady Aldermere answered was brief but complete. "Miss Ashby? She travels with us." "Miss Ashby?" Lady Marguerite repeated. She had the same quality of attention her son possessed, though in her it had acquired 30 additional years of social refinement and was therefore more dangerous. "Welcome to Westhaven, Miss Ashby. I hope the journey was not too long." "It was 16 miles, Marin said. "I found it very manageable." If Lady Marguerite heard anything significant in that response, she did not show it. "We have arranged rooms for all our guests. Mrs. Pierce will show you to yours directly." Later, Lady Marguerite would describe this exchange to her son over the evening's quiet dinner before the larger company assembled for the formal meal. She said she found it very manageable, she told him. After walking 16 miles, without blinking, Julian set down his wineglass. "She walked the entire distance? Apparently. In those boots? You noticed her boots?" "I noticed everything," he said, which was neither an answer nor a deflection, and his mother knew better than to push it. She simply refilled her own glass and said nothing, which was its own kind of response. In the guest wing, in a room that was smaller than the rooms allocated to Philippa and Charlotte, and larger than she had expected, Marin sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her boots. She unlaced them carefully and set them side by side beneath the chair. Her feet, examined with clinical attention, were not blistered. She was lucky in her feet, always had been. She had her mother's build, she suspected, though she had no clear memory of her mother, and the late Earl had spoken of her exactly once when he called Marin into his study to tell her that she was provided for in his will and that he hoped she would manage. She had thought about that conversation, often in the 14 months since. He had looked at her across his enormous desk with the expression of a man who is aware he has done a great deal less than he ought, and is choosing to address this awareness through practicality rather than sentiment. He was not a cruel man. He had simply organized his life to minimize difficulty, and she had been, from the beginning, a form of difficulty he had never quite resolved. A maid knocked and entered with hot water and a message that dinner was at 8 and that she was included in the company if she wished. She washed her face and her hands and changed from the brown traveling dress into the only evening dress she owned that was not entirely plain. It was dark green, old at the elbows if examined closely, but the color was good, and she had repaired the hem herself with stitches small enough to be invisible. She pinned her hair with the pearl pins that had been her mother's, the one inheritance Lady Aldermere hadn't known to look for. She went down to dinner. The dining room at West Haven Park seated 32, and that evening all 32 seats were occupied. Marin found her place card between a young clergyman named Mr. Hartley, who had been invited because he was the nephew of a viscount and would never trouble anyone, and a widow named Mrs. Cavendish, who was 60 and entirely content. The Duke sat at the head of the table, not near her, far enough that she could observe him without appearing to. He ate with the same economy with which he moved. He spoke to the person on his right, then the person on his left, without neglecting either. He listened when listening was called for. He did not perform conversation or withhold it. He was simply present in the room, which made him the most present person in it. Lady Aldermere sat 6 seats down the table on the opposite side. She had recovered her composure fully by dinner and was brilliant in deep blue silk, Philippa and Charlotte arranged on either side of her like wings. Philippa had already done something clever with the arrangement of her chair to ensure she faced the Duke's end of the table at the most favorable angle. Charlotte had simply smiled at everyone, which was her most reliable strategy and frequently her most effective. Marin ate her soup and listened to Mrs. Cavendish describe a walking tour of the Cotswolds she had taken in her youth. It was a very good description. Mrs. Cavendish had genuine feeling for landscape and expressed it without sentiment. Marin asked her 3 questions and meant all of them. "You are not at all what I expected," Mrs. Cavendish said at the end of the second course, with the frankness that was the privilege of age. "Aldermere's natural daughter, yes? I knew the Earl. He was not a bad man. He was, however, a cowardly one in the specific area of things that mattered most." Marin looked at her. "That is a precise observation." "I have had 60 years to make precise observations." She patted Marin's hand once and returned to her food. "You will be all right. I have an eye for women who will be all right eventually, and it takes me about 10 seconds. You took 8. Marin was still considering this when she became aware, without looking up, that the general direction of the table's attention had shifted. She looked up. The Duke was looking at her, not with any particular expression. Simply looking, in the way he appeared to look at most things, with his complete attention directed at the subject and nothing held back from it. When her eyes met his, he did not look away, which was unusual. Most people who were caught looking look away. He simply held her gaze for a moment, acknowledged it with something that was almost a nod, and returned to his conversation. Mrs. Cavendish, who had also observed this exchange, said nothing. But Marin noticed the small adjustment of her expression, the particular arrangement of not quite a smile that was its own form of commentary. After dinner, when the company separated by custom for a period before reconvening, Marin moved to the edge of the long gallery where the women assembled. She was not uncomfortable in rooms. She had spent enough time at the periphery of rooms that she had made a study of them. She knew which corner offered the best view, which arrangement of furniture created accidental conversations, which people were looking for conversation and which were performing the appearance of looking while actually wishing to be let alone. She was doing this, watching and cataloging with the quiet industry of someone for whom watching is both habit and pleasure, when the Duke appeared at her elbow. Not arrived, appeared. She had simply failed to observe his approach, which was notable because she usually observed approaches. "Miss Ashby." His voice at conversational distance was exactly what she remembered, direct and low and not performing anything. She turned. "Your Grace." He was holding 2 glasses. He offered her one. She took it because refusing would have required an explanation she had no interest in giving. "You are not in the principal conversation," he said, indicating the cluster of women near the fireplace with a slight inclination of his head. "No." "Is that by preference or circumstance?" It was such a direct question that she answered it directly. "Preference tonight. Circumstance usually." "Tell me the difference." She looked at him. She was trying to work out what he was doing. He was not performing interest. He was not the kind of man who performed things. But neither was he the kind of man who asked questions of women at the edges of rooms out of nothing more than good manners. "Tonight I have something to think about," she said. "Most evenings I am positioned at the edges of rooms because that is where the family finds it convenient to position me." "The family," he said. "Lady Aldermere's family?" "Of which you are technically a member." "Technically?" He was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the room in general, not at her specifically, but she had the sense of a mind moving through connected thoughts with considerable speed. "She made you walk the drive this morning?" "Yes." "The whole of it?" 16 miles, yes?" He looked at her then. The full attention again. Not uncomfortable exactly, but very complete. "Has this happened before?" Maren considered the question, and then decided that if she was going to answer one honest question, she might as well answer all of them. "On journeys of any distance, for approximately 14 months. The silence that followed was one of the more interesting silences she had experienced in recent memory, because it had texture to it. He was not silent because he lacked a response. He was silent because he was choosing his response carefully, which meant there were several available to him, and he was selecting the most appropriate one. What he finally said was, "What does the will specify?" She blinked. She had not expected him to know about the will. "Transport," she said. "It specifies transport. It does not specify the manner of it." That was an oversight. Or it was deliberate, and the Earl assumed common decency would fill in the gaps. Something crossed his face again. That same contained quality she had noticed on the drive. "And you are 3 years from the annuity." She stared at him. "How do you know that?" "My solicitor has some familiarity with Aldermere's estate affairs. I asked him this afternoon when I returned from the drive." The honesty of this was so complete that she did not know immediately how to respond to it. He had asked his solicitor, after seeing her walk behind the carriage, this afternoon. She processed this and said carefully, "Why?" The Duke of Ravensmore looked at her with that dark, direct, temperature-changing attention and said, "Because I found the situation unacceptable, and I prefer to understand the legal framework of things I find unacceptable." He did not do anything immediately. He was not the kind of man who did things immediately. He thought first, and then he did things, and the things he did reflected the thinking so precisely that by the time they happened, they appeared to have been inevitable. Over the next 3 days at Westhaven Park, Maren watched him with the same attention she brought to everything, which meant she noticed things that other people were too busy managing their own campaigns to observe. He spoke to his mother on the second morning for 40 minutes in the library. She had been passing on her way to the breakfast room, and the door was not fully closed, and she was not attempting to listen, but the word annuity reached her clearly, and she walked on quickly. He had a conversation with Mr. Hartley, the clergyman, on the second afternoon, which ran considerably longer than it appeared. She had been reading in the garden when they walked past on the path, and fragments of it reached her. The legal differences between guardianship and wardship, the rights of natural heirs, the question of whether a will's executor could be challenged on the basis of failure to meet implied duties of care. On the third morning, he sent for Lady Aldermere. He did it through his secretary, a note delivered to Lady Aldermere's room at 10, requesting her presence in the estate office at 11 for a brief matter of business. Lady Aldermere came to breakfast looking uncertain for the first time since Maren had known her, which was to say for the first time ever. Maren did not attend this meeting. She was not invited to it. She sat in the garden with her book open on her lap, and she read approximately no pages of it. The meeting lasted 45 minutes. Lady Aldermere emerged from it with the color of a woman who has been very clearly explained to, and went directly to her room without speaking to either Philippa or Charlotte, who were in the morning room practicing music and exchanging increasingly anxious glances. An hour later, the Duke's secretary knocked on Maren's door. He was a neat, efficient man of middle age who communicated precisely the amount of information required by each situation and no additional. He said, His Grace requests a moment of your time, Miss Ashby, if you are available. The estate office, when convenient. She put down her book. She smoothed her dress. She went. The estate office was a functional room, not designed for the impression of power, but for the exercise of it. Desk, chairs, ledgers, maps of the estate on the wall, a window overlooking the kitchen garden. The Duke stood at the window when she came in. He turned and said, "Please sit," and waited until she had before he sat himself. "I have spoken with Lady Aldermere," he said. "Yes?" She had assumed as much. "I have explained to her several things." He looked at her steadily. First, that the will's requirement for transport was almost certainly intended to include the standard provisions of comfortable travel, and that her interpretation of it is legally questionable in ways her solicitor appears not to have examined, and mine has now examined at considerable length. Murren said nothing. She was listening with her entire attention. Second, that the manner in which you have been transported was observed this week by witnesses of sufficient social standing, that any continuation of the practice will produce consequences for the Aldermere family's social position that will far outweigh whatever satisfaction Lady Aldermere derives from the arrangement. And third, she said, because there was plainly a third. The Duke looked at her for a moment. She had the impression that the third thing was the most considered of the three, and he was determining exactly how to present it. Third, I have made her an offer regarding the annuity. Marin's hands tightened in her lap. She did not let this show anywhere that he could see. What kind of offer? The annuity is tied to the estate's income in a way that makes it vulnerable to the executor's management of said income. Your solicitor, if you had one, would have flagged this years ago. You don't have one. I cannot afford one. You now have one. I have retained him on your behalf. He has already reviewed the will and identified 3 separate areas where Lady Aldermere has managed the estate's income in ways that appear designed to minimize the annuity's eventual value. He paused. This is the kind of thing that becomes inconvenient to defend in front of a chancery court. Murren was very quiet. I offered Lady Aldermere the alternative of settling the annuity immediately, he continued. The full amount as originally intended by the late Earl, paid now rather than in 3 years, in exchange for the matter being handled privately. She stared at him. The full amount? Now? Yes. And she agreed. Something moved across his face, not quite satisfaction. Something quieter. She did not have a great deal of room to disagree. The room was very still. The kitchen garden outside the window had been put to bed for the autumn, and the rows of bare earth were precise and orderly and oddly comforting in their simplicity. Maren sat with her hands in her lap and thought about 3 years, and 8 months reduced to an immediate settlement, about the cottage and the small press, about the fact that she was sitting in a room with a man who had, within 48 hours of watching her walk behind a carriage, mobilized a solicitor, researched a will, analyzed an estate, and converted an abstract moral objection into practical legal pressure. "Why?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "You have asked me that before. And you told me you preferred to understand the legal framework of things you found unacceptable. But organizing a legal resolution to my specific situation goes considerably beyond understanding a framework." "Yes," he agreed. "So why?" The Duke of Ravensmore was quiet for long enough that she began to think he would not answer. He was looking at the kitchen garden. Then he looked at her. "Because," he said, "I have spent 5 years attending to things I found unacceptable and making them acceptable, which is what the management of estates and the management of a family name requires. And I have become very good at it. And I have also become very aware that there is a difference between things that are unacceptable because they are inconvenient and things that are unacceptable because they are wrong. The first kind requires patience and strategy. The second kind requires action." He paused. "You walked 16 miles behind a carriage because a woman with legal access to your father's estate found it useful to demonstrate her authority over you. That is the second kind. Murren looked at him. She was trying, with her full attention and all of her 14 months of practice reading rooms and people, to determine whether this was performance. She could not find any evidence that it was. "You don't know me?" she said. "No." "You acted on behalf of someone you don't know?" "Yes." "That seems—" She stopped. "Unusual," he offered. "I was going to say costly, in terms of social capital and time and the attention of your solicitor." It was. He did not appear troubled by this. "I find it does not matter particularly." She was quiet again. The kitchen garden held its orderly rows. Outside the window, a late swallow crossed the sky and was gone. "The settlement will be sufficient," she said finally, "for the kind of life I was planning." "What kind of life were you planning?" she told him. She told him about the cottage and the annuity and the sewing and the small press and the practical guides for rural households. She told him because he had asked with the same directness he brought to every other question, and because there was something about his quality of attention that made withholding information feel like a waste of it. She told him accurately and without embellishment, and she watched his face while she talked. He did not smile. He did not look politely interested or sympathetically condescending, or any of the other things people's faces did when she told them things. He simply listened, and when she finished, he said, "The market for practical household guides is larger than most publishers understand. My estate manager's wife mentioned the same gap independently last spring." She looked at him. "Did she?" "She has been writing one. She cannot find a publisher willing to risk it." "That," said Murren, "is exactly the problem." They looked at each other in the office with the bare kitchen garden beyond the window, and something happened between them that was not romantic exactly, or not only romantic. It was the recognition of two people who think about the world in similar ways, finding each other unexpectedly in a room where they had come for a different purpose. The house party ran its appointed fortnight. Lady Aldermere treated Murren with a careful, neutral courtesy that was, if not warmth, at least the absence of its opposite. Philippa watched the situation with an intelligence she rarely deployed but possessed in quantity, and said nothing, but thought a great deal. Charlotte was simply kind, in the way she was always kind, which was without method and therefore without condescension. The Duke spoke to Murren on 7 separate occasions over the fortnight. Each conversation was different. Each was direct. Each ended at the natural end of the subject, rather than being extended by social convention or curtailed by it. He asked about her mother once, and she told him what little she knew. He told her about his father, who had also died young and also left behind a tangle of unresolved intentions. They had, she discovered, a shared familiarity with the experience of being in proximity to grief that has not been adequately expressed. On the last morning of the house party, she came down early to the breakfast room to find him already there. This had happened twice before. He looked up from his coffee and said good morning, and she sat down and poured tea, and they ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before the conversation started in whatever direction it chose that day. This morning, he said, "The settlement will be transferred within the fortnight. My solicitor has confirmed the paperwork." "Thank you," she said. And then, because it was true and because she believed in acknowledging true things, "I am not sure how to adequately express what this means." "You have expressed it," he said. "Every time you have talked about what you intend to do with your life, that is an adequate expression." She looked at her tea. "You might have looked the other way on the drive. Most people would have. Most people do look the other way. It is one of the primary mechanisms by which things that are wrong continue." She looked at him then. "Why did you stop the whole procession? You could have sent a footman. You could have arranged a carriage quietly after arrival. You didn't have to stop everything." The Duke considered his coffee for a moment. Outside the breakfast room window, the park was coming into the slow amber light of October morning, the grass still wet, the trees exactly at the turning point between green and gold. He said, Because stopping quietly would have addressed your comfort. Stopping visibly addressed the behavior. He paused. The behavior needed to be addressed visibly. She was quiet. He continued, with the same evenness he brought to everything. There were 40 people on that drive. Several of them were Lady Aldermere's social acquaintances. Several were mine. The calculation was straightforward. You calculated it? On the mount, yes, in about 4 seconds. She looked at him. He looked at her. The breakfast room was very quiet and the park was very golden outside the window. She said, "You are a more deliberate person than most people appear to understand. Most people are more interested in what I might do for them than in understanding how I do things." He paused. "You are the first person in recent memory who has been interested in the second question. The second question is more interesting." "Yes," he said, "it is." They finished breakfast. The morning assembled itself around them, the sounds of the household rising, the other guests eventually descending. They were not alone in the room for much longer, but the quality of what had been said in the quiet of it remained in the air as the room filled, a kind of understanding between two people that does not require additional words to be complete. The procession assembled for departure at 10. The 3 Aldermere carriages were loaded in order. Philippa and Charlotte were handed in by footmen. Lady Aldermere, with a composure that had clearly cost considerable private effort, produced from somewhere in the architecture of her dignity a gesture toward Marin, a slight inclination toward the carriage door that was not an invitation exactly, but was not a prohibition either. Marin stood at the foot of the steps. The Duke was in the drive. He had been there since 9, seeing off guests with the same steady attention he brought to everything. He was working his way systematically toward the Aldermere party. When he reached Marin, he stopped. He had his gloves in one hand. He looked at her for a moment with his complete and total attention, the kind that doesn't leave anything out. He said, "I hope the road is comfortable." "I expect it will be," she said. "My solicitor will write within the fortnight." "Yes, you said. Miss Ashby." A pause. He was looking at the road ahead, briefly, in the direction the carriages would travel. Then back at her. "If the practical guides come to anything, if you find yourself needing a publisher unwilling to dismiss a market simply because it has not been properly argued, you should know that I have some investment interest in this area, and my state manager's wife has her manuscript in a drawer for one of exactly the kind of argument you appear capable of making." Marin held very still. "Are you suggesting a business arrangement?" "I am suggesting that practical people in adjacent situations sometimes find it useful to address those situations in coordination." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked at her with his characteristic directness and held it. She said, "That seems like a practical arrangement." "It does," he agreed. He offered his hand. Not the offered hand from the drive, the formal gesture of assistance. This was a handshake, deliberate and level, the kind exchanged between equals at the beginning of an understanding. She shook it. His grip was warm and certain and ended cleanly. He inclined his head. She turned and stepped up into the carriage, taking the forward seat without asking for it. Lady Aldermere arranged herself in the corner. Philippa and Charlotte exchanged one final astonished glance and said nothing. The carriage door closed. The procession began. Through the window, as Westhaven Park's drive unrolled beneath the wheels, Marin watched the house recede and the park open and the October sky hold its particular blue above the turning trees. She thought about the settlement coming within the fortnight, about the cottage, about the manuscript in the estate manager's wife's drawer, about a man who had stopped a procession of 40 people because he had calculated in 4 seconds that the behavior needed to be addressed visibly. She thought about the handshake. Mrs. Cavendish had been right. She would be all right eventually. She had suspected as much for 14 months. She suspected it now with a certainty that was not hope, which is fragile, but something more like knowledge, which is not. The road from Westhaven was 16 miles. The carriage made it in a little under 2 hours. Marin arrived home in a carriage. The letter from Ravensmore's solicitor arrived on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the fortnight he had specified, which told her either that the fortnight had been conservative or that the solicitor was unusually thorough. The settlement was exactly what the late Earl had intended. It was, in absolute figures, more than she had calculated when working from the will's original language, which meant the estate manager's wife had been right that Lady Aldermere had managed the income downward. She had already found the cottage. It was in Somerset, in a village small enough to have good air and a lending library and a coach road that connected, eventually, to Bristol and to publishers. The second letter arrived the following Tuesday. It was from Ravensmore directly. Our side, it was shorter than the solicitor's letter and considerably more direct. It informed her that his estate manager's wife, Mrs. Collingwood, had heard through her husband that the Miss Ashby situation had been resolved favorably, and had asked whether she might write. He was enclosing her address. He trusted Miss Ashby would not mind the connection. There was a postscript. It said, "The question you asked on the last morning was the first interesting question I had been asked at Westhaven. I thought you should know that." Marin sat at the table in the lodging house where she was still living on reduced terms while the cottage was made ready. She read the letter twice. She thought about interesting questions and what it means to be asked one, and what it means to be the kind of person who asks them. She wrote back. She kept it to 2 paragraphs. The first confirmed she was glad to have Mrs. Collingwood's address and would write immediately. The second said, "The drive from Aldermere House to Westhaven was, in retrospect, the most useful 16 miles I have ever traveled. I say this not without some irony, but mostly without it." She sent the letter. She wrote to Mrs. Collingwood. She began corresponding with a printer in Bristol who had expressed theoretical interest in practical publications, a conversation that would, over the following 6 months, become less theoretical. She moved to the cottage in March, when the Somerset countryside was exactly at the stage of spring where you could believe in most things. She had a kitchen garden. She had a desk by the window. She had, it was becoming clear, a working correspondence with the Duke, whose primary mode of communication was directness, and whose secondary mode appeared to be occasional and extremely well-considered postscripts. She was not sure precisely what this meant for the future. She was sure, with the same quality of knowledge, rather than hope, that had sustained her since October, that the future existed and that it was hers and that she was in it. That was enough. That was more than enough. She was all right. She was, she thought, in the particular quiet of the March morning, with the garden outside the window, and the letters stacked on the desk, and the world organized at last into something she had built herself, considerably better than all right. She had always suspected she would be. It had simply taken a stopped procession and an offered hand, and a man who calculated visible justice in 4 seconds on a gray horse to make it finally, irreversibly, true.